This is Rosecliff, Newport's white marble dream, built by a woman who refused to be forgotten, designed by Stanford White, patterned after Versailles and finished in just 3 years. It was supposed to last forever. It did, but the life inside did not. What kills a palace built to defy time? Money, loss, or indifference? In August 1902, under the mild Newport moon, more than 600 guests descended Bellevue Avenue in carriages whose lacquered doors mirrored the light of burning torches. They came to witness the unveiling of Tessie Ulrich's new summer estate, an all-white marble shadow that gleamed like crystal above the Atlantic bluff. Inside, a full orchestra played beneath plaster garlands copied from Versailles. Servants in white gloves moved in disciplined formation, pouring champagne chilled in silver pails imported from Paris. Stanford White's marble staircase floated upward without visible supports, a feat of both engineering and vanity. By midnight, newspapers were calling it the most perfect house in America. Yet within a single generation the crowds were gone, the curtains drawn, the music muted. The Ulrich's fortune, like many Gilded Age dreams, dissolved under the weight of its own perfection. How did a palace built to embody timeless dominance lose its purpose almost overnight? To understand, we must return west, far from Newport's damp Atlantic wind, to the blistering Nevada desert, where Tessie Ulrich's inheritance first emerged from the earth in rivers of silver. The story of Rosecliff begins in a place nearly opposite in tone and texture to Newport's sea-washed marble, Virginia City, Nevada. In 1859, the discovery of the Comstock lode transformed a dusty mining camp into a roaring center of speculation and sudden wealth. Through tunnels nearly 1,000 feet deep, men pursued veins of silver so profuse that even waste rock glittered with promise. Out of this fever rose 4 principal magnates, later called the Bonanza King. Among them stood Senator James Graham Fair, a wiry Irish immigrant whose mechanical talent and shrewd sense for ore bodies brought him unimaginable fortune. Fair's earnings at the peak of the 1870s mining boom were colossal. The Consolidated Virginia mine, which he controlled with John Mackay and 2 partners, produced millions in bullion each month. Fair invested his profits in San Francisco real estate and railroads, cementing his position in the Western plutocracy. His social ambitions soon followed. San Francisco's high society, still insecure beside old Eastern family, adored displays of wealth, and few displayed it better than Fair. His daughters, Therese, called Tessie, and Virginia, were sent east for schooling and finishing, their every gesture trained toward the polish expected in New York parlors. The elder Fair died in 1894, leaving an estate nearing $40 million, a sum rivaling the Vanderbilts. Tessie inherited a fortune not only measured in money, but in the possibility of transition, from frontier roughness to old-world refinement. This trajectory was typical of the Gilded Age, an era that turned raw extraction into social alchemy. The mines of the Rockies fed the mansions of Fifth Avenue, and each fortune sought symbolic purification through architecture, manners, and marriage. For Tessie, the ultimate purification came in 1890 when she married Herman Ulrich of New York. His lineage reached back through mercantile respectability, Ulrich and Company, the American agents for Nordshire Lloyd Shipping Line, and his connections spanned the polished network of Astors, Livingstons, and Roosevelts. To Eastern society, the union looked ideal, Western fortune joined to Atlantic pedigree. Yet beneath the harmony of money and name lurked an old prejudice. To many in Newport, the Silver Princess from Nevada remained a curiosity, tolerated on the strength of her inheritance rather than heritage. That subtle divide would define Rosecliff itself, a house intended not just as comfort or ornament, but as evidence. Tessie Ulrich meant to prove that Western gold could rival and even surpass East Coast breeding. To do so, she turned to America's most sought-after architectural alchemist, a man who knew precisely how grandeur could disguise insecurity, Stanford White. The alliance between Theresa, Tessie, Fair, and Herman Ulrich seemed, on the surface, a perfect equilibrium of American power. He represented inherited position, discretion, and transatlantic connections. She brought the boundless liquidity of Nevada's mine. Their wedding in 1890, held at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York, was less ceremony than proclamation, gentle introduction of Western mineral wealth into the bloodstream of Eastern respectability. Herman Ulrich was everything polite society rewarded: handsome, cosmopolitan, and a descendant of one of the city's established merchant family. His work as American manager for the Norddeutscher Lloyd Steamship Company connected him directly to the flow of luxury goods and passengers crossing the Atlantic at a scale unseen before. In a time when the ocean liner itself symbolized industrial mastery, Herman stood as a modern patrician, orderly, technological, confident. Tessie Ulrich, by contrast, possessed a dynamic energy that often startled the quiet codes of old New York. Fiercely loyal and determined to conquer society on her own terms, she became a leader in Newport's social contests almost immediately after her marriage. She adopted the rights of Mrs. Astor's 400 with the precision of a scholar, collecting couture gowns, curating guest lists, studying the conversational nuance that separated the right people from merely rich upstarts. Yet even this iron discipline could not dissolve her sense of outsiderhood. The fair girls had entered an environment where lineage functioned as both password and defense. To many hostesses of the era, newly made fortunes, no matter how vast, occupied a probationary space between admiration and amusement. Tessie's response was architectural, a declaration in stone meant to silence doubt. Newport, that coastal theater of competition, offered the ideal stage. By the 1890s, Bellevue Avenue had become America's most concentrated corridor of ostentation. The Belmonts, Berwins, Vanderbilts, and Astors erected summer mansions that rivaled Europe's palaces both in scale and service. A new house there was not just property but credential. Each facade, each imported mantelpiece, spoke its owner's dialect of ambition. Tessie purchased the site of an earlier, modest wooden cottage called Rosecliff, formerly owned by Nevada friend and fellow Silver Queen, Nevada Sharon. It offered a bluff with sweeping Atlantic views, an architectural blank page on which Stanford White could inscribe perfection. White, already famous through his firm McKim, Mead & White, had recently completed the Boston Public Library and numerous private palaces. His genius lay not only in design but psychology. He understood that architecture could heal social insecurity by transforming it into. For Tessie, he proposed an American echo of the Grand Trianon at Versailles, a white palace distilled to lines of order and grace, suggesting inherited cultivation rather than sudden expenditure. The commission would demand colossal sums and 3 years of construction, yet to Tessie and Herman, the expense mattered less than the message. Rosecliff was to be their visual argument that mining money could achieve the aesthetic purity of royal taste. With the ink on their architectural contract barely dry, Stanford White summoned craftsmen from New York, Paris, and Italy. Bricks, marble, iron, and glass began converging on Newport's harbor, and as masonry rose along Bellevue Avenue, so too did anticipation. What sort of perfection would Mrs. Ulrich unveil? When construction began in 1899, Newport already bristled with grandeur, yet Stanford White aimed for restraint within luxury. He studied engravings of Louis Roman XIV Grand Trianon, noting its long, symmetrical rhythm and open colonnades framing air rather than enclosing it. While neighboring cottages bristled with turrets and heavy ornament, Rosecliff would glow in luminous simplicity. White's choice of all-white glazed terracotta and marble was unconventional for coastal Rhode Island. Salt air was notoriously cruel to stone, but the material symbolized purity, and Tessie demanded white. Blocks from Vermont quarries were hauled east and laid in courses that caught the Atlantic light like porcelain. The resulting 150-foot facade appeared almost weightless. Visitors ascending the curved drive first glimpsed it through a sequence of manicured hedges designed to evoke a ceremonial approach. The house then revealed itself suddenly, radiant, aloof, framed by lawn and sea. Despite its French exterior, Rosecliff remained fully American in structure. The steel skeleton and fireproof floors represented cutting-edge Gilded Age engineering. Hidden behind French paneling were modern boilers, electrical wiring, and speaking tubes for servants, a technical precision matching Herman Ulrich's shipping background. Inside, scale replaced ostentation. The grand salon extended nearly the full depth of the house, its parquet floors imported from Germany, its walls lined with delicate Louis Roman XV-style plasterwork. A curving staircase rose in a single, self-supporting sweep, Stanford White's coupe de theater. This central space could transform from domestic calm to ballroom by merely opening mirrored doors leading onto the terrace, where orchestra and lanterns waited during gala season. To furnish the rooms, Tessie imported antique boiseries from France and commissioned new pieces carved to match. Each room possessed a palette of white and pale gold. Even upholstery followed the tonal thesis of purity. The effect, contemporary critics wrote, was not of heaviness but of constant daylight. In this decision, Rosecliff diverged from neighboring mansions whose dark mahogany panels still echoed Victorian gloom. White's design did more than please the eye. It placed the Ulrich family in dialogue with European aristocracy while asserting a distinctly American optimism. Rosecliff celebrated triumph over raw nature, the transformation of desert silver into coastal marble, of noise into symmetry. As workers completed the great terrace that stepped elegantly down toward the cliff's edge, Tessie ordered massive beds of roses planted below, the only strong color permitted on the ground. They served as both literal and symbolic foundations for the house's name. By the summer of 1902, the stage was finished. Invitations printed in Parisian script declared Rosecliff ready for its debut, a social theater now awaiting its audience. On the night of the inaugural gala in 1902, guests crossing Rosecliff's marble threshold entered a choreography of symmetry and spectacle. Stanford White's interiors guided the eye in controlled sequence, entrance hall to grand salon to terrace, an unbroken axis designed for processions rather than privacy. Where other Newport houses flaunted eclectic clutter, Rosecliff made restraint its luxury. The ballroom, often called the most perfect in America, was structurally daring for its time, a 40 by 80-foot void with no visible supports interrupting the ceiling's gilt plaster grid. Iron beams concealed above gave the space heroic span, a physical manifestation of the age's confidence in engineering. Sunlight filtered through tall arched windows by day. At night, concealed electric bulbs scattered through crystal chandeliers diffused a modern, almost imperceptible glow, an innovation that spared guests the smell and heat of gas flame. Beyond the ballroom stretched a line of drawing rooms whose cool palettes merged quietly into each other. The salon in faded rose silk, the morning room in ivory damask, the dining room glimmering with mirrored panels reflecting silver flatware. The alignment of doors created repeating corridors of light, photographically doubling the guests themselves. White understood that these reflections transformed even simple movements into theater. Each figure became part of the architecture, an actor framed by proportion. Outdoors, an Italianate garden descended toward the cliff in 3 terraces cut by a marble staircase. Urns imported from Florence punctuated the descent, culminating in a balustrade overlooking the Atlantic. On clear evenings, lanterns were hung along the rail so that light seemed to trace the edge of the continent. Yet Rosecliff was no mere museum of grandeur. Hermann Ulrich insisted that modern convenience balance ceremony. Inside, hidden doors revealed linen lifts and ice water plumbing. Between floors, a primitive air circulation system carried sea breeze through bronze grates, moderating summer heat. Kitchens, unusually bright and sanitary, reflected the progressive era's fascination with hygiene and efficiency. Visitors often described the experience less as entering a house than as stepping into an experiment, the American attempt to construct civility by design. Rosecliff's clarity of line and whiteness of surface reinterpreted European monarchy through industrial precision. Versailles reimagined for a democracy with stock exchanges instead of bloodline. It worked. For 2 decades, Rosecliff defined Newport taste. Newspapers chronicled every reception Tessie hosted, measuring her floral arrangements and gauging the worth of her guests by the inch. Yet grandeur bred inevitable fatigue. As the architecture attained still perfection, the people within began changing or disappearing. The age that had summoned Rosecliff's marble walls was entering twilight. Behind the elegance of its ballrooms, a quiet question gathered force. What happens to a palace when the world it was built to impress no longer cares to dance? Each summer from 1902 onward, Tessie Ulrich orchestrated Rosecliff as though conducting an opera. Invitations, dispatched months in advance, were engraved in Paris. Orchestras were booked to perform waltzes arranged exclusively for her evening. Menus arrived from Delmonico's kitchen in New York, shipped daily by rail. On a typical August weekend, carriages lined Bellevue Avenue for nearly a mile. White-gloved footmen lifted hemlines as guests ascended White's marble stairs into a space perfumed with tuberoses and illuminated by mirrored light. The Ulrich entertainments became benchmarks against which others calibrated extravagant. The circus-themed ball featuring live elephants on the lawn. The winter masquerade, where the ballroom floor was transformed into an indoor skating rink of polished tin, cooled by blocks of ice brought from Providence. Yet beneath ritual perfection lingered strain. Herman, more comfortable in boardrooms than ballrooms, often absented himself for business in Europe. His fascination with shipping efficiencies and maritime law hardly resonated with Newport's gossips. Tessie's enthusiasm, meanwhile, grew more intense as public affirmation subtly cooled. The very elegance she demanded from her guests created distance. Her events impressed but rarely delighted. Still, for a brief shining interval, Rosecliff functioned precisely as intended, proof that mining money could generate aristocratic culture. Reporters from the New York World chronicled every floral species in her winter conservatory. The Newport Mercury printed diagrams of her seating arrangements as lessons in modern etiquette. The paradox was that success carried obsolescence within it. When everything perfect had been accomplished once, repetition dulled the thrill. Younger heirs sought sport instead of ceremony, automobiles instead of dances. By 1908, the number of major balls at Newport had already begun to decline. Even Mrs. Astore's famed lists lost authority to newer, freer voices. Tessie's brilliance persisted, but the oxygen of admiration was thinning. Rosecliff stood luminous but increasingly solitary, a palace of prestige on a narrowing social island. The next turn in her story would strip away illusion entirely. Wealth could purchase marble and music, but not continuity. When news of tragedy arrived from Europe, its echo moved through Rosecliff's halls like a cold wind. In September 1906, a telegram reached Newport that froze every conversation across Bellevue Avenue. Herman Ulrich had died unexpectedly while returning from Europe. A vigorous athlete in his early 50s, he succumbed to pneumonia aboard the Kaiser Wilhelm Roman II. The news stunned even those who had wearied of the couple's perfection. Within days, reporters massed at Rosecliff's gates. Society papers framed the tragedy as the end of an age. For Tessie, the loss cut deeper than social position. Despite the emotional distance that gossipers like to magnify, hers had been a genuine partnership, she the hostess, he the logistical backbone. Without Herman's practical oversight, the clockwork of grandeur slowed. Letters from the period reveal her retreat into privacy during the winters, living instead at her New York townhouse. The great ballroom in Newport shuttered for seasons at a time. The economic calculus of the Gilded Age was also shifting. New taxes, antitrust scrutiny, and the panic of 1907 signaled the tightening of easy capital. Many Newport mansions, wavering under their own maintenance costs, reduced staff or closed entirely. Rosecliff remained immaculate only through Tessie's stubborn insistence and abundant inheritance. Yet an unspoken melancholy crept into the few parties she still hosted. The waltzes persisted, but the dance floors grew sparser. Guests whispered about Europe's pre-war tensions and the rise of the motorcar elite, new fortunes moving faster, staying nowhere long. The concept of the summer colony began to feel antique. By the time World War I erupted in 1914, Newport's glamour felt oddly discordant beside newspaper images of drafted soldiers and factory workers. Some families, Vanderbilts, Berwins, Belmonts, continued to entertain, but the national mood had shifted toward restraint. Tessie attempted to adapt, offering her estate for charitable benefits and Red Cross events, but even philanthropy could not disguise decline. When she died in 1926, her obituaries described her as one of the last grand dames of the true Gilded Age, a title that once would have thrilled her, now sounding more like an epitaph. Her only son, Herman Ulrich Jr., inherited Rosecliff but lacked any desire to inhabit its demanding ritual. For him, the marble palace stood as a monument to a vanished conversation between wealth and taste. Through the 1930s, dust replaced perfume, closed shutters muted the sea light, servants departed, gardens withered, furniture sheets gathered the salt air. In effect, Rosecliff had disappeared not through destruction but irrelevance. Yet the house still stood, intact, immaculate in structure, waiting. America, meanwhile, changed its mind about what such palaces meant. prosperity of the Jazz era would soon collapse, and marble monuments of another century were about to meet the economics of the new one. By 1930, Newport's cottages faced realities that their original owners had scarcely imagined. The maintenance cost of a 65-room estate could surpass a factory payroll. Inheritance taxes devoured endowments once thought inexhaustible. The social architecture that had justified those expenses, seasonal hierarchy, elaborate rituals, armies of domestic servants, no longer existed. For Rosecliff, maintained only intermittently by distant heirs, survival became largely accidental. Its caretaker kept the roof sound. Otherwise, the house drifted in suspended animation. Compared to the Breakers or Marble House, which remained under watchful family foundations, Rosecliff had little advocacy. A few years later came calamity on a national scale, the Great Depression. Bellevue Avenue's lawns grew rough, orchestras silent. Some neighboring estates were sold for the value of their fixture. Others razed outright to avoid taxation. The Ulrich heirs debated similar fates. Photographs from 1936 show Rosecliff's facade streaked by sea moisture, the grand terrace partly overgrown, an image of still beauty on the edge of abandonment. That so few protested when such houses vanished reveals a deeper cultural chain. The Gilded Age had celebrated money as art. The 1930s demanded money as survival. America now viewed palaces less as civic achievements than as cautionary relics. Yet Rosecliff's location and structural integrity saved it from destruction. The marble resisted decay. Its engineering, ahead of its time, kept walls plumb and roofs watertight. For nearly 20 years, the house existed as an immense, quiet riddle, too sound to collapse, too expensive to use. The next chapter of its existence would depend not on inheritance, but on rediscovery, on a generation who, amid post-war optimism, began to sense that losing such places meant losing chapters of the national memory itself. By the late 1940s, the once exclusive Bellevue Avenue no longer meant aristocracy. Its long facades, framed by yawning gates, inspired less envy than curiosity. Tourists, no longer guests, stood at rusting fences, speculating which marble mansions might surrender next to weeds or wrecker. Newport, like so much of post-war America, was redefining luxury as mobility. A good car, not an estate. Rosecliff, miraculously intact yet deeply anachronistic, changed hands several times during the years of drift. A decade after Tessie Ulrich's death, ownership passed through distant relatives and investors who treated it less as a home and more as an object of uncertain value. Empty ballrooms drew moisture. Marble required constant attention. The property's tax assessments exceeded any rational rental income. Across town, demolition crews dismantled piers such as Shadau-sur-Mer's stables and the once thriving Fair Street Theater. When newspapers called Newport's palaces white elephants, the phrase carried both pity and accusation. To some, they symbolized waste. To others, a lost craft beyond reprisal. Preservation was still an eccentric cause, an indulgence, not a policy. Then quietly, a shift began. World War II had produced a generation trained in mechanical restoration. Engineers, draftsmen, architects returning from service with new respect for precision and history. Among them were small circles of Rhode Island citizens who realized that the destruction of these estates would erase a tangible record of America's artistic maturity. The trigger for Rosecliff came in 1947, when Mr. and Mrs. J. Edgar Morris of New York purchased the property. They recognized its structural soundness and romantic potential, transforming it back into a functioning residence while preserving White's floor plan. The Morrises entertained in the grand ballroom once more, though on a modern scale of cocktail parties rather than orchestral balls. Their stewardship stabilized the estate long enough for historians to take notice. Meanwhile, nationally, the preservation movement gathered momentum. In 1945, the American Institute of Architects published warnings about the vanishing architecture of leisure. By 1949, Sheldon Keck's laboratory pioneered techniques to conserve wall surfaces and painted ceiling, methods that would soon find application in Newport. Rosecliff therefore stood at the hinge of two eras, the decline of private luxury and the birth of public heritage. Its survival now posed a new question, not who owned it, but who should inherit its meaning. The answer would arrive through collective effort. A society was forming in Newport that believed these marble relics still had something to teach. Out of volunteer committees, it would become the backbone of preservation across the United States. In 1949, 6 Newport residents founded the Preservation Society of Newport County after hearing that the breakers, Cornelius Vanderbilt Roman II Palace, faced uncertain future. Their idea was simple but radical. These estates belonged not merely to heirs but to history. When they opened the breakers to the public in 1949, crowds lined the avenue. Visitors arrived not to sneer at extravagance, but to study it, as evidence of craftsmanship and ambition no longer possible to replicate. The society's success changed perceptions overnight. Other families, realizing that opening their houses could offset taxes, followed suit. Marble House, the Elms, and later Rosecliff transitioned from private burden to shared inheritance. When the Morris family offered Rosecliff to the society in 1971, conditions were remarkably favorable. The structure required restoration but little reconstruction. Preservation crews documented every molding, replacing damaged plaster with material of identical composition. Electricians discreetly rewired chandeliers for modern safety. Gardens, mapped from early photographs, were replanted along original parterres. The project was guided by principles then emerging nationally in conservation ethics: authenticity of material, reversibility of interventions, readability of changes to future scholars. The result preserved not merely aesthetics but evidence. Tool marks, carpentry method, the story of how Americans once translated aspiration into architecture. When Rosecliff reopened in 1973 as both museum and event venue, it re-entered the cultural conversation it had been built to dominate, but this time as teacher rather than emblem of exclusion. School groups toured the Grand Salon. Architects meticulously measured its proportions. Its openness marked a democratization of what had been the Gilded Age's ultimate private symbol. And then, as if completing a cultural orbit, popular imagination rediscovered Rosecliff in an unexpected medium. The camera lens, once restricted to polite magazine spreads, would soon claim it for cinema. When film crews arrived at Rosecliff in the 1970s, the grand house once again filled with lights, voices, and motion. Different lights, different music, but the same choreography of admiration. Directors discovered that Stanford White's symmetrical rooms needed almost no art direction. Every frame already looked composed. Marble surfaces absorbed reflected lamp glow with the soft diffusion of silk. Among those early productions, The Great Gatsby, 1974, proved defining. Its cameras drifted through the ballroom that had hosted real Gilded Age waltzes 70 years earlier, converting historic opulence into cinematic memory. Later, films such as True Lies and Amistad returned to Rosecliff, each using its geometry to evoke a universal fantasy of elegance. Through these appearances, millions viewed, often unaware, a faithful document of America's architectural ambition. Yet beneath Hollywood's glitter lay genuine scholarship. Preservationists treated every filming agreement as an opportunity for maintenance funding and interpretive outreach. Engineers measured vibration from equipment to ensure the marble floors remained unharmed. Art historians drafted new wall texts explaining who Tessie Ulrich had been and why her marble statement mattered. Visitors arriving in the decades that followed found Rosecliff transformed into both museum and living artifact. The ballroom displayed exhibits on Gilded Age social custom, calling cards, dance programs, silver place setting, all sourced from Newport archive. Upstairs galleries examined the industrial origins of the fortunes behind those banquets, the machinery of the Comstock lode, the shipping routes of Norddeutscher Lloyd, the telegraph webs that connected the very world whose glamour Rosecliff embodied. This dual narrative, surface splendor, underlying labor, gave the mansion new relevance. Students studying economics visited to examine wealth distribution. Architecture scholars analyzed White's composition using laser scanning. Preservation scientists monitored humidity as part of a multi-mansion research collaboration. By the early 21st century, Rosecliff had become both Newport's most filmed and most academically cited resident. Its annual visitorship rivaled that of the Breaker. Yet unlike its original audience of social people, these crowds arrived from every background, discovering that the Gilded Age, stripped of envy or condemnation, offered a living case study in American creativity and impermanence. In a sense, Rosecliff did disappear overnight. Its original purpose vanished, leaving behind a shell that only later generations learned to interpret. Now, against the Atlantic horizon, it stands as proof that even obsolescence can be repurposed into education. Rosecliff was conceived as a fortress of privilege, but history revised its role. What began as aspiration hardened into architecture, crumbled into silence, and then re-emerged as memory. That cycle, construction, abandonment, rediscovery, mirrors the broader rhythm of American wealth itself. Standing in the Grand Salon today, one hears a layered echo. The faint music of Tessie Ulrich's orchestra mingled with the footsteps of students and restorers. The building teaches by contrast. Its marble permanence exposes the impermanence of status. Its survival exposes the resilience of craft. Preservation does not sanctify excess. It contextualizes. To read these houses intelligently is to understand the energy and anxiety that built them. A society seeking identity through architecture, striving to turn industrial triumphs into moral elegance. Rosecliff reminds us how short that transformation lasted and how beautiful its evidence remained. Each restored panel and polished balustrade connects 2 centuries of citizens who chose curiosity over cynicism, continuity over demolition. Through them, the Gilded Age ceases to be a parody of overindulgence and becomes an inquiry. What do we build and for whom when we imagine permanence? If this story expanded your understanding of America's Gilded Age, thank you for keeping history alive, one house, one lesson at a time.